while Gerald assaulted Kippy and Rhonda. Hours later, they were back on the road.
They get in the van and they go out to an area east of Sacramento. They pull into this agricultural area, pull down a road, and Gerald gets out, takes the girls out, gets a tire iron out of the back of the car, bludgeons both the girls, gets back in the car. They're still moving, gets back out, has I think it's a .25 caliber semi-automatic, goes out and shoots both girls.
At the heart of impotence is humiliation. And humiliation for men is a source of a great deal of anger and frustration. And the people who most remind him of his humiliation are women. So he would identify women as the people who should be his victims because they're the ones to blame.
They leave the victims there in the ditch and drive back to wherever they're staying and clean up the van and so forth.
Charlene claimed she had not known Gerald would murder the girls. But Gerald, it seems, had always had a twisted sex drive.
He's a good talker. He was smooth. He was like that ever since I known him, you know, even as a kid. He thought he was God's gift to women, you know. He'd do anything to get their attention and make them laugh and so forth.
And Gallego's pursuit of sexual gratification proved to have no boundaries.
Gerald had a daughter, and I know that he was charged with molesting his daughter.
He first raped his own daughter, who was very young, and carried on this relationship for some period of time.
Most people that are abused do not grow up to be abusers themselves, but those individuals that grow up to be abusers, almost all of them have a history of being abused.
Typically, the predator will introduce sexual acts that cross boundaries for the compliant person. His story of wanting sex slaves had to do with trying to get Charlene to go along with this and get her to see that this is for both of their benefit, that this would enhance their sex life, because otherwise he was bored.
Here was a classic pedophile who was stuck with the idea that he needed that younger girl to satisfy his perversion.
Gerald Gallego would not be satisfied by his first murders, and 1 year later would draw his young wife into his plans again.
I don't think the first two victims, she realized that he was going to kill them. But then you come the second set of victims, the same thing. I think she knew that that was going to happen, but her desire to please Gerald was stronger than her knowledge of what's right and wrong.
Charlene's confession would finally solve the mystery of the disappearance of teenagers Brenda Judd and Sandra Colley from the fair in Reno. And she revealed how she had played an active role in the capture of the 14 and 13-year-old friends.
Without Charlene, it is doubtful Gerald would have been able to abduct these young women. It would have been very, very difficult. But Charlene brought that about because she befriended the girls and put them at ease, and they didn't think any type of danger at all was there.
As Charlene drove away from the fairground, Gerald molested the girls in the back of the van.
The fact that he abducts two girls at once would tell me he wants one to watch what he's doing so that he can then move on to her, and she'll be in such a state of terror that it will again signal to him what a powerful person he is.
The ordeal lasted for almost 2 hours before Charlene pulled off the desolate highway. As she waited in the van, Gerald took the girls from the back and one by one bludgeoned them to death.
I can't even imagine what she went through that night.
Angry, extremely angry. He had no right to touch her. I mean, she was 14. She was our family's everything. He had no right to steal that from us.
Charlene had detailed information about them, but she couldn't place exactly where it was they had been buried. We spent considerable time out looking and taking her out to try to find those sites.
That was a real desire, was to try to return those girls to their parents. And that was the saddest part, is that during this whole investigation, I was never able to do that.
By the time of Brenda and Sandra's murders, the tally of victims had reached 4, all of which might have avoided abduction were it not for Charlene.
Charlene Williams grew up in a well-to-do home without anything in particular that should have signaled that there might be trouble ahead. But apparently her parents were hoarders of a sort.
They were not very tidy housekeepers, I know that, because they had a lot of stuff stacked up in one bedroom. That was a mess.
It's not clear whether they also had obsessive-compulsive disorder, which often goes with hoarding, in which case, as she grew up, she could easily felt rebellious against the restrictions and the rigidity of a household like that. Because as she became a teenager, she did a few more things that were kind of not the good girl image that people had expected of her.
Charlene had some sort of deviant sexual arousal pattern herself. She was involved in 3-way sex with her former husbands and so on. It didn't really work out, but when she met Gerald, she was very, very willing to go along with this.
The Gallegos' murders fit a pattern that would be repeated all too often. And Charlene's twisted tour revealed a method of operation highlighting the depravity of their murderous marriage.
She walked down here, and when she came to the place, obviously she had some knowledge of where they were buried, because she was standing right in a gravesite, and she said this is where they were buried, right here.
17-year-old Stacy Redican and Karen Tweaks were also abducted from a Sacramento mall.
She described that everything pretty much took place inside of the van. Charlene was actually in the driver's seat, but she turned around, and that originally both girls were naked, and that he was going through the process of raping the one girl, and the other girl was just sitting and kind of sniveling and crying about what she was seeing happening to her friend, and of course believing that she was going to be next. So it had to be a pretty horrific thing for these girls to go through. Had to have been sheer terror to be out here at night.
Anything that is involving total domination of someone else, total control over a victim, to just brutalize her any way he wants, that is what is arousing to someone like Gallego.
Charlene claimed she was intimidated by her husband and fearful to deny his deviant desires. Gerald, however, claimed that Charlene had been a willing and active participant in the sexual abuse and murder of their innocent victims.
Usually when there's 2 individuals involved in a sexual murder, one is a dominant person and the other is more like an assistant. In this case, Gerald was the dominant person, Charlene was certainly the assistant, but the assistant plays a role nevertheless. After the first abduction, the first murder, Charlene could have left. There was nothing keeping her there from Gerald. She could have gone, but she didn't want to. She chose to stay there. And she was part of this, to be sure.
And Gerald's insatiable desire showed no signs of abating. Charlene described how in just over a month, she had helped Gerald kill 2 more women. One, a pregnant 21-year-old hitchhiker named Linda Aguila, whose body was left among the rocks of the barren Oregon coastline. The other was Virginia Mokel, a barmaid from Sacramento, whose body was left bound in fishing twine on the banks of the Sacramento Delta.
He had the ability to murder